For as long as I can possibly remember, my favorite pastime has been baking sweets. Ever since I was allowed to lay a finger on my mother's stove by myself, I've been baking. And when I tell you that this banana pudding cake is by far the best thing I've ever made on a first try, I am not even kidding. So let's get into this cake mix that Dolly Parton has come up with. She has a banana cake mix, and on the back she has a banana pudding cake recipe. And when I tell you to follow these instructions, do exactly as she says. I was so ecstatic when I came across this box inside of Walmart. She has quite a few box cake mixes on her line, but the banana one stood out because it wasn't typical. When I'm in a grocery store, I like to look on the back of the boxes and see what unique recipes they have, just in case I want to recreate one. And lo and behold, she definitely had one that I wanted to try. Off rip, this wasn't no typical box cake mix recipe, as it called for 4 eggs and milk, when I'm used to those box cakes that require just 1 or 2 eggs, a bunch of oil, and water. It never calls for milk. So I just knew this one was going to be really good. Now, typically, my husband doesn't eat sweets, and when I'm in the mood for something, I bake it for myself and try not to eat it all. But for this once, I had company come over. My husband had a friend come into town, and I remember the last time he came around, he actually really liked my cooking. He liked me baking. So I went out of my way to make sure that he had some sweets in the fridge for when he got the munchies at night. I started making this cake when my husband went to go pick up his friend from the airport. So I had a good hour to an hour and a half to prepare this cake, and I wasn't disappointed in the process. I would say the longest part was the baking and the cooling, but outside of that, doing everything else to make this cake come together was fairly simple. I love a good challenge, but it's even better when something tastes fantastic and isn't that hard to make, so I was all in on making this. Now, the one thing I did switch up was not using the box suggestion of spraying Pam onto the cake pans. I used my mom's method of buttering the pan and then throwing a little bit of flour on it, tapping it so that the flour spreads. So that way when you put the cake mix in, when it bakes, it'll come out really easy and smooth. This was a trick that my mom taught me when I started baking at a very young age. It was something that I enjoyed doing, and she said, "You're not going to be messing up my good pans with your little experiments." So she had let me in on this little tip that I've been doing ever since then. Now, you can very much use a cooking spray, but like I said, I prefer to stick to my roots and what I know and try it this way. I don't think it hurts to do it either way, but I like my way better. Another little habit that I picked up from watching my mom was cleaning up as you go. Not only is it good for the video, but it actually helps when you're ready to eat that treat and you're not facing a bunch of dishes that kind of discourage you from ever wanting to bake again. So as I was baking the cake and cracking the eggs and all that stuff, I basically threw everything away as I went. So there was no waste and there was nothing left over for me to do but taste it after I was done. But anyway, as I'm putting the cake batter into the pan, I noticed how thick the batter is, and I'm just thinking, oh, this is going to be good. This cake is going to be moist and spongy. I already had my hopes up for what this was going to be like, because this wasn't one of those cakes that had water in the mix, so it's only right that it's thicker, right? Well, anyway, I'm excited. I'm anticipating a fantastic cake. It already smells amazing. So I pop it in the oven for a good 20 minutes and let it do its thing. And then in the meantime, I'm going to start doing what the rest of the back of the box says to start prepping for the filling and the icing that's going to go on top. So in true banana pudding fashion, you need Nilla wafers. The recipe calls for 28, but we're going to eyeball it and just add a few more because between using it for the recipe and me snacking on a few, I'm going to need more than 28. The recipe also calls for a portion of the banana pudding mix, so I am going to list all of the portion sizes of the ingredients on the screen so that way you can see what I'm doing. One of my favorite parts of this recipe was the vanilla pudding aspect. I just love how they portioned the ingredients so that way the vanilla pudding can be used as an icing when it thickens. I don't know why, but I never thought to do this before, and like duh, when you add less milk, pudding thickens even more. So that was just kind of genius on their part, but also just kind of obvious. But either way, I'm sold on that whole technique, and I'll be doing that for some of my own personal recipes. But moving on, we're going to crush some of these vanilla wafers because they are going to be the decoration for the center and for the sides of the cake when we finish it. So yeah, we're going to crush those up and make sure they're into little chunks and not actually granulated. We're going to put that to the side. Now that our cakes are ready, we're going to pull them out the oven and put them on my cooling stones to allow them to cool until they're completely cool. We don't want them warm. While those are cooling down, we're going to go ahead and start the whipped cream aspect of it. And this part of the recipe had me a little confused because I'm like, if we're using icing, what is the whipped cream for? But I continued on with the recipe and I wasn't disappointed. So like you may or may not know, heavy whipping cream when mixed at a high speed will turn into a stiff whipped cream. Like duh, it's in the name, right? Heavy whipping cream. But not many people know that you can use it to make your own whipped cream, which is so wild to me. Some things that we think are obvious are not always that obvious, so I figured I'd just share that little tidbit. But the longer you mix it for, the thicker and the stiffer it gets, and we want this to be stiff as it will be on the very top of the cake. So we want it to be in almost icing thickness. And per the instructions, we're going to do about 2 tablespoons of the buttercream icing and add it to our whipped cream. When I tell y'all Miss Dolly Parton knew what she was doing with this recipe, she hit it right on the nose, because I'm going to tell you now, this whipped cream mixture right here really evened out the flavor palette of the cake. Now, we all know how icing can be very sweet, but that whipped cream mellowed it out so much. But yeah, moving on into the bananas, it calls for you to cut the bananas into 24 slices so that way you can layer it in between the 2 layers of cake and on top. Now, I feel like the bananas like this actually makes the cake age faster, because once the bananas start to brown, the cake don't look like it's that good anymore. So if you want to skip that part, I don't think you'll miss it. So yeah, I think if I was to make this cake again, I would not do it with the bananas, just so it doesn't look like it's aged. But as promised, look how that cake slid right out of that pan. Yeah, my mom's little hack never fails. And it's not her hack, but hey, she passed it down to me, so in my eyes, it's hers. I'm just going to scrape the edges of the pan of the other one to loosen the edges, and it comes out smooth just like that. So we're just going to set that to the side while we prepare our first layer with the pudding. So you see how thick that pudding became once it sat for a bit? It is literally like icing. Like, my mind is blown, okay? I've never thought to use pudding like this. Now, I was a little bit skeptical at first if this was going to be enough pudding for the center of this cake, but trusting the process and following the directions on the back of the box, I did what I was told. At this point, there's no turning back, and I'm not really disappointed in what I'm seeing and what I'm smelling, so I can already tell this cake is going to be bomb, and it's already fun to make, so yeah, let's go into the next step. The next step requires you to take those bananas that we sliced and place them on the first layer on top of the pudding. Now, this is where I say I could have gone without doing this because, again, after a day or 2, these bananas will turn brown. So if you don't plan on eating this cake right away, I wouldn't put the bananas on. But for the sake of trusting the process, we're going to do everything that box said and then go ahead and add a little bit of our crushed cookies to that layer of cake. Then once we have that set, we're going to add our final layer on top of the pudding and the bananas and the crushed cookies, and we're going to go in with our icing. Taking the entire jar or whatever's left after you took out those 2 tablespoons to do the whipped cream, you're going to spread it over the cake and try and get it as even as possible. Now, in the beginning of the video, I had showed 2 jars of the icing, and that's typically because when I'm making the cake, it requires 2 jars, because when I'm making a layered cake like that, I like to have a thick layer of icing in the center and I like to have thick icing on top. But in the center of this cake, we have vanilla pudding, so I didn't really need that second icing, but I just wanted to be sure. Now, I may be annoying some of y'all with my icing skills, but I'm just here to get this cake done and make sure it's done in time for my company to get here and try it out. So I'm not really trying to do a beautiful professional job. So don't get on me about how there's more icing on one side than the other, because best believe I watched his back. I was like, no, just spread it one more time. There's so much icing right there. But hey, it is what it is. So the next part of the recipe calls for you to take the rest of those crushed cookies and add it to the bottom sides around the cake. This was such a cute touch. It definitely brings the cake alive and makes it look less messy when you cover up the sides like that with the cookies. It's actually a touch that I wouldn't have thought of by myself if I had to make this cake without looking at the box. So yeah, I wouldn't skip this step as it presents well when it's done like this. Now that we have all of that together, we're going to take that whipped cream that has the 2 tablespoons of icing in it and dollop it all on top and spread it. I wish I could fully describe what the whipped cream does to this cake, because I thought it was going to be overkill, being as though there was icing all around the cake, there was pudding in the middle, and now this whipped cream mixture on top. But when I tell you it pulled it all together, the coolness, the light and fluffiness of the whipped cream that has that little bit of the vanilla buttercream in it, oh my gosh, chef's kiss. At this point, I'm really excited. I'm now decorating and I'm just like, I'm this much closer to being able to bite into it. I'm super geeked. My mouth is watering. I'm just trying to film this so I can get it over with and dive in, okay? The final touch of putting this cake together is to add the bananas to the top. And like I said before, I would not add the bananas again unless this cake was being eaten right away, because they do turn brown after a day, especially if it's not refrigerated. So I would suggest only making this cake if it was to be eaten immediately. And in my case, I cut into this bad boy as soon as I got the shot that I needed. I was so excited. I cut into it and my mouth was literally watering. I couldn't wait. Again, this recipe had to be by far the best one that I've made. And on the first try, I fall in love with it. Yes, absolutely 10 times yes. The only thing I would do different is eat this with some milk. I didn't have any more after I made this recipe. So go get some milk. Eat this cake. You're probably going to have more than one slice. It is that bomb. And to be honest, I've only had this one slice. And after I let my husband's friend taste it, he ate about half of the cake by himself. And he was only here for 2 days. And a little pro tip so that your cake lasts longer, make sure you cover it and put it in the fridge. So that way your whipped cream don't melt and your bananas stay fresher longer.
I don't have to find an aesthetic. I am an aesthetic. I mean, I'm sure there's somebody out here right now who's going into Pinterest trying to type up all these adjectives to describe me.